Okay, well, welcome everyone. Welcome to episode 11 of TIL, or the Interchain Lab. We are here with Skip again. Welcome back. We love to have you on. You impressed us last time with a lot of big brain ideas, and in a surprisingly short amount of time, the big brain ideas went on chain. My name is Tog. I am one of the regular co-hosts here from the support lab, and we also have Water Spinner from the support lab here. And as a reminder, you can ask questions at any time about any one of the things that we're talking about in the chat. Or you can request to speak if you would like to speak out loud. But why don't we get started? Jeremy, hello.
Hello.
All right.
Also joined on the same account is David.
What's up?
What's up, guys?
Sup.
I like that. We're already starting off in a nice, easy environment. That's always my favorite.
Yeah, I mean, well, they've already been through this once, right? Like,
Yeah.
they're just back again, old friends.
Just hanging out, just having fun.
Right, chilling. All right. Well, welcome. First off, congratulations with ProtoRev being installed in the Osmosis chain.
Thank you. It's been a lot of fun, a lot of work, but it's been really cool to see since it launched, for sure.
Yeah, I second that.
Yeah.
So, what sort of things? Well, let's get it. Water Spinner, what do you have?
I don't really want to get too much into. I feel like most people here know what ProtoRev's about, and I think we're just here to kind of get a little deeper. So, I just want to start real quick talking about the launch. So ProtoRev launched with V15. The account is sitting at about 4,400 right now. It's almost like 500 a day or something like that. So I just wanted to ask if you could give a little TLDR on how the team is feeling about this quote-unquote experiment with on-chain MEV, and is the module performing as expected, or better, worse? Is there any review on that?
Yeah. So in total, ProtoRev has recaptured over about 5,500. And the reason why the module count has 4,400 is because every week, once per week, it batches out Skip's kind of cut, such that when you want to look at total profits, you kind of have to add up both of those accounts. But the amount it's captured, at least from my perspective, has actually exceeded my expectation, particularly related to. So, for those that don't know, ProtoRev has essentially two ways it tries to backrun transactions. One way is through a method that we're calling a highest liquidity method, which completely on-chain, it will identify routes that are likely to have MEV, and it does so by trying to find the highest liquidity pool for any given denom pair. And then using those highest liquidity pools, when you see a swap, it tries to make a route using the highest liquidity pools and backrun it. And so this is really efficient to do on-chain, but there's a downside in that if a user swaps on a denom, that denom cannot be what starts or ends the route. So for example, if a user swaps Osmo to Juno, then this highest liquidity method cannot find a arbitrage route that would start and end in Osmo. So there's a limitation to it. And we expected actually this route picking to really require another method called hot routes, which is us essentially adding routes to the module itself that will be checked for every back run. And we just thought the highest liquidity method would actually leave a lot on the table. And once we released ProtoRev, we realized that the highest liquidity method actually captured a majority of the back run arbitrage profits in and of itself. So much so that when we added the hot route methods, so we added hot routes last weekend. What was clear after we added the hot routes was that a majority of the denom now that it accrues is Osmo, but we're kind of unclear right now on how much extra MEV profits, for example, denominated in USD, that it is generating using the hot route method. So it's clear that it now is accruing more in Osmo, but it's unclear that if we never added hot routes, how much less, USD value we would be generating just with the highest liquidity.
Interesting.
So I think everybody on the team has been fairly surprised in how the efficient on-chain method, how much that actually is able to capture.
So, really quick question, because I know that Water Spinner has another one about hot routes. So you said you added them last weekend. When was the upgrade? It was a couple of weeks ago at this point, right? A week or two?
The upgrade was last Thursday.
Oh,
Yeah.
jeez. Okay, so you added that in just before the upgrade went live, right?
Just after. So it
Just
happened.
after.
So ProtoRev went live last Thursday. We added it that Saturday morning.
Oh, okay. So then that actually, so you can do that TM. So you can add a different logic to routing without needing a chain update or upgrade.
Sure.
Yeah, there's a special account that's configurable through governance that has permissions to essentially enable, disable hot routes, as well as adding new base denominations to the highest liquidity method. So, yeah, and there's a bunch more sort of detailed permissions that the account has, but everything that account can also do is also very bounded. So in case something malicious were to happen, like the chain won't halt, ProtoRev will just essentially be unprofitable.
Cool. That answers my question.
Yeah. That kind of basically answered what questions I was going to have about hot routes. I was just going to ask a little bit about them, and then I was going to ask what deemed a hot route. And it seems as though you guys are just, looking at the highest. If I understood correctly, the highest liquidity routes are deemed hot routes. Is that? I know that's a really simple measure of it, but
Yeah. So essentially the hot routes are routes that are externally sort of inputted into the chain. And then the highest liquidity routes, those are the routes that are automatically generated on chain. So hot routes are essentially, say for example, like off chain, we have some analysis and we determine that there are routes that ProtoRev can be using, but is currently not using because its base primitive is just the highest liquidity method. What we can do is then take those routes that we see off chain that are currently not in the module and then just insert them. So yeah, they're two distinct sort of paradigms of
Yeah.
generating the arts.
so I get is that it's kind of like sounding like now a hybrid-esque of on-chain MEV getting a mixture of hot routes from off-chain like data and sources.
Exactly. Yeah.
Wow. Okay, that's pretty awesome. So I have another quick question before we go into a little bit more. So the last time we talked was in the building of ProtoRev, all of that. I did want to, I guess, in talking, this is kind of a perfect segue into that because in talking about hot routes, that's something that you guys said you didn't have set up before. So is there anything else, how did testing go up to launch? Was there anything helpful in finding any other issues? Did you guys switch up any other algorithms that you had talked about on our previous TIL as to launch?
Yeah, so I think the biggest thing that we were considering up to launch was exactly how long and how expensive ProtoRev on-chain actually is. So there were a bunch of ways we were sort of trying to approach this, whether it be how much gas is being consumed through simulation, because ProtoRev is doing simulation on-chain, and that can be scary because without any sort of guardrails, it can go and do some really wild and crazy shit. So we were very considerate into sort of that thought process and how we can build sort of, I guess, like very versatile guardrails. So what we determined was to essentially create this sort of simulation environment where we can, to some degree, estimate how expensive every single swap on every single pool type might be. So like a swap on like a stable pool might take like 3 milliseconds. A swap on a balancer pool might take like a millisecond. Um, and this is also something that can be dynamically changed over time. So if for some reason it becomes more costly to do a swap on any one of these pool types, we can update that. And essentially using this sort of fairly baseline heuristic to like determine how expensive it might be to simulate, we were able to build in this sort of guardrail and execution like protection system so that ProtoRev is very bounded and that it essentially at the moment will never take more than 100 milliseconds a block to simulate.
And going along those lines, the last time we did the like Discord event, we were mainly kind of in the mindset of pure balancer pools. And so the first algorithm we ever tried to implement was what's called an analytical solution, where it essentially is a single math equation that you can put inputs to, and it'll give you, for example, the optimal amount you want to trade into that route. But it only worked for balancer style pools. So what we ended up implementing on chain was an iterative approach. So we essentially have, like, given a route, we now binary search to figure out what optimal amount in we should put for maximum profit. And the large consideration here was we wanted a method that could generalize and allow for us to backrun swaps on all pool types currently supported by Osmosis and in the future. And so when we we ended up choosing this iterative method, taking into account that we do want to backrun and capture MEV for balancer pools, stable swap pools, future concentrated liquidity pools. And the analytical method just didn't give us that flexibility or generalizability. And so a lot of what David is talking about around bounding is with us choosing this iterative method to figure out these parameters we need to put in, it does add extra compute. And so our kind of answer to that was adding these guardrails such that we never have to worry that this extra compute actually, impacts the chain block times at all. And so that was an update from the last conversation we had around the methodology.
Yeah, around an update around the algorithm and I guess route sourcing that you're getting into now. That's that's some pretty good stuff that you guys are getting into. I guess my next kind of question, I don't know. I guess this is maybe more just a personal question because I don't know if I was understanding this correctly. Proto V2 post threshold encryption, is that still a thing? And is that already here, or is that something that's in the works to come for later?
Yeah. So, I mean, that's still a thing. We haven't really worked on it at all or thought about it much, largely because it is like ProtoRev V2. The last time we explained it, and for those who don't know, the idea is that Osmosis wants to implement threshold encryption. And when you have threshold encryption, actually, let me take one step back. So, part of the design of ProtoRev today is that it backruns every single transaction. And the reason is because if we think about trying to backrun, once per block, you run into the issue that searchers and arbitragers can get in between that. So a fast, efficient searcher, they see a transaction, they can backrun it being the next transaction. And then if we only had something that background or try to rebalance pools once per block, we may not get there in time. And so current ProtoRev backruns every single transaction. Now, in the future where Osmosis implements threshold encryption, you can imagine we do not have to necessarily backrun every single transaction. If we're not worried about searchers getting in between transactions within a single block, we potentially have the ability to only backrun and rebalance pools once per block. And if we only have to run an algorithm once per block, then we can run an algorithm that takes more time, but can efficiently and optimally rebalance all the pools on Osmosis itself. And so there's still intent to do that, but we haven't really been putting much thought into it until kind of threshold encryption and the things necessary for that related to vote extensions get kind of further down the line. And also, it's unclear that one thing around threshold encryption is that it can push, right? So threshold encryption essentially says these transactions in the mempool are encrypted. But you can imagine a world where off-chain actors still run order flow auctions, for example, and you still have searchers backrunning these transactions in between them. And it's just unaware from the protocol perspective, but maybe the wallet or the front end has a system that leaks that information to searchers. So I guess it's not definitive whether or not with threshold encryption we immediately want to go a once per block rebalancing algorithm, or if there is still benefit to try to be, backrunning every single transaction.
Definitely sounds like it's a like we said earlier, it's iterative, and especially it's kind of wild to think that it works as well as it has out of the gate, which is amazing and great to see. A quick question from one of the audience members regarding hot routes. So I think you slightly mentioned it, but if you could clarify, like, when are hot routes introduced or stopped? Is it like at epoch or just at will?
Yeah, so hot routes today are introduced at will. And so at Skip, we have an internal process of, so in general at Skip, we've been tracking arbitrage on Osmosis for a while. And we have a dashboard called satellite.skip.money that is currently not working today. So like it actually hasn't updated for the past week, but before the past week, it's been working and I'm getting to the fix today. So it'll be back up to date very soon. But we've been tracking arbitrage and arbitrage activity and MEV activity on Osmosis for a while now. And so us internally, what hot routes means is essentially, us tracking general MEV arbitrage activity on Osmosis, the routes that if we were added would increase ProtoRev revenue versus just not adding them. But currently this is an at-will process that at Skip, we may publicly release kind of a more in-depth process of how we do that. But there's no timer or epoch related to that on-chain.
Okay.
All right.
So, if you don't mind, Water Spinner.
Yeah. I actually see one more question by Dang Miss. Do we see transactions for swaps done by ProtoRev? I don't.
So on MintScan, this is actually something that we want to add. But at the moment, the trading. So when ProtoRev executes a swap, it's not making a new transaction. It's essentially just doing some special stuff at the end of every transaction. And right now, it's kind of difficult to tell exactly where ProtoRev is executing these swaps on chain through MintScan, just because there's a lack of logging and event emission from ProtoRev. So one thing that we're working with the Osmosis team to do relatively soon is to actually integrate that so that MintScan can essentially display this transaction happened, then in the logs you can see ProtoRev ProtoRev simulation. But that functionality is not in ProtoRev. It's not on chain at the moment.
Yeah, so basically it's happening, it exists, but because the logging doesn't exist in a really, in the way that we're expecting, we just can't parse it out of the chain data right now.
Yeah, I mean, so data sleuths can do so. And so right now, the events, so there are still, right, there are always transfer events
Right.
and like swap events just happening purely through the GAM module and normal transfers.
Right.
And so, like, a data sleuth can look through events and find when our module account makes a transfer.
Oh,
And then they'll
that's
be able to see based on that module account transfer and swap which transactions are being ProtoRev activated. But that is like, it's not a process that MintScan shows nicely
Right.
at all. It's not a process that indexers can index easily. And
Right.
so though like the ability for easier indexing and MintScan to show it the way people expect is what we're working on. But it is still there in the data. It's just not bubbled up in a clean way.
Yeah. That's completely understandable. As someone who is currently looking at how to index and transactions by event, it's really nice when it's clearly spelled out instead of having to hunt for a specific address in all of those logs. Um, that's amazing. So with ProtoRev V1, this version, it was expected to bring in around 10 to 35,000 per about 100 million worth of DEX volume. How are you guys looking on track for that? Have you been tracking it?
I think based on this first week, in this first week being, a very small amount of data, we are on track in the range. So I looked at this yesterday on like the Osmosis poll statistics, where I believe this last week had around like 28 million maybe in DEX volume. And ProtoRev in the same time captured around over 5,000 of USD value in that time. So if you extrapolate the 26 or 28 million, times it by 3 for like a 90 million estimation, we may be looking at like 15,000 of extracted value. So we are in that range of 10 to 35,000. It'll be interesting to see. I think that estimation is a good estimation, but it removes a lot of factors around different pool types and, how many pools have the shared assets to do so, et cetera. And so I think it'll be interesting to see kind of how this estimation evolves and like what practically speaking it looks like. But we are in, a ballpark, I guess. So based on this last week, you could expect, 5,000 worth of USD for every 27 million of volume or something.
Well, I mean, from what it sounds like is, it at least from what I'm hearing, it sounds like Skip was pleasantly surprised at the level of capture that was happening.
Yes. Yeah, and sometimes you're your own biggest haters,
Right.
you're just always surprised when things go well. And so
When things work.
Yeah,
Right.
self-criticism is sometimes the harshest, that's for sure. As I don't know if you guys are looking in the chat, but Riley from Stride says that they are also working on showing begin and end blocker transactions on MintScan and set to hit them up if you guys want to maybe talk about that.
Oh, that'd be fun. Yeah. I mean, there's so much extra data that kind of gets lost in non-normal transaction messages. That it feels like there are so many ways we can bubble it up easier. So we'll def reach out. That'd be fun.
I mean, to me, at least when it comes to looking at a transaction, the replication of data and the transactions are beefy, especially IBC transactions, which they are what they are. But if people can figure out how to refine all of that data in there to still be just as effective and as secure, then it would be great. Water Spinner, do you have other questions?
Yeah. So I kind of want to shift now, kind of going away from ProtoRev. Well, I guess not going away from ProtoRev. This kind of ties all into it. So I did want to talk a little bit about POB, Protocol Owned Building. But before we get into that, I just want to get a little bit of background on Skip MEV Tendermint and what the difference is between that and just Tendermint. And then that will kind of bring us into the talks about POB and what you guys are doing with that.
Yeah. So, ProtoRev. So for those who don't know, and those who maybe only focus on the Osmosis community, ProtoRev isn't the only thing that Skip works on. We work on kind of MEV solutions, broadly speaking, for the Cosmos ecosystem. And Osmosis is interesting because it's an application-specific chain, which allows us to have things like ProtoRev that, within consensus is really aware of everything possible on the chain. And this may change and evolve as Osmosis evolves, but as it stands today, we can really kind of hone in on which transactions and which messages are specific swaps and what we want to do with that. But if you take chains like Juno or Evmos or Terra or these more smart contract virtual machine-based chains, you can kind of quickly think how hard it may be in consensus or for the protocol to really be aware of what's going on based off of just general smart contract execution calls. And so for those types of chains, the kind of go-to solution we present is something called Skip Select, which is an off-chain auction such that searchers submit to Skip they call bundles, which is saying, hey, this is a transaction. Like a searcher will say, hey, Skip, this is a transaction that creates MEV, and I would like to back run it, and I would like to bid $10 to be the right to back run this transaction. And one thing to note here is we only allow back runs, so we don't ever allow sandwiching or front runs on a user transaction. And then when a searcher bids, every block, there's kind of an auction that happens. So all searchers will tell us how much they're willing to bid to back run transactions, and we choose the highest bidder as long as they respect, no front running, no sandwiching, etc. And then we give that set of transactions to the validator that's up, proposing the next block. And so this is what's called Skip Select, or just a different solution we have around more generalized chains. And Mev Tendermint is a fork of Tendermint, which is the consensus layer that allows for validators to receive these bundles from us and then include them on chain. And so we are now really, we've been in the space, and especially through this experimentation with Osmosis, that doing as much of the stuff on chain such that you can have parameters that are defined by governance, you can see everything in a visible way, is kind of the gold standard, right? Is the thing or the North Star we want to be reaching towards. And even Mev Tendermint today and Skip Select today relies on Skip being trusted actors and, uses our centralized systems. And increasingly over time, we want to say, hey, that's good enough for now. And, we have no intention to act malicious, but let's work towards more decentralized on-chain, solutions. And so that's kind of where POB lives. And fortunate for us, we have head of POB at Skip, David Turfe, sitting next to me to explain more.
Yeah, so to follow what Jeremy was saying, so essentially, we want to take the same framework that we currently have with Mev Tendermint and replicate it on chain through a new type of module, which we're calling POB, which stands for Protocol Owned Builders. And the idea builds off exactly what Jeremy was saying, where we want to be propagating the ethos of like sovereign MEV, where chains have the right, delegators have the right to sort of determine how blocks are built, what type of behavior, whether it's malicious or not, is enabled, and then how to distribute any MEV that's generated on chain to whatever purposes or causes delegators might be interested in. And essentially, POB at its current stage is an in-protocol top-of-block auction where instead of submitting to a separate RPC through a centralized provider like Skip, you just submit it directly on-chain as a special transaction type. We have an auction that's being essentially hosted directly on-chain, and then With the addition of the new SDK version 0.47, there are two new things that are really cool, which are called prepare and process proposal, which will essentially move the mempool from the Tendermint side to the actual application side. So you can build the block entirely from the application, allowing you to do cool things like having auctions directly on chain. And the basic idea is that leveraging prepare proposal and process proposal, we can build this top of block auction directly on chain and then follow all the normal transactions that we would see instead of doing everything in a centralized manner off chain.
That is really, really neat. We have quite a few questions in the chat right now. So firstly, Riley quickly wanted to know and have you guys talk on whether more valuable is extractable from Osmosis versus other AMMs like DEXs launching on Neutron, or let's say the kind of the like on Juno. I know you guys have a module type thing there or script there, and then also value extractable from stable swap pools across different parameters, amplification factors, scaling factors, etc. If you think that stable swaps might be better for extractable value than balancer pools, I think that's what Riley meant. Riley, correct me if I'm wrong in the chat.
Yeah. No, those are great questions. So for the first one, whether more value is extractable from Osmosis versus other AMMs. Realistically, today, most other AMMs launched on other Cosmos chains are essentially Uniswap v2 forks. And
you're not supposed to say the quiet part out loud.
Oh yeah. Sorry, they're innovative dexes everywhere. But so the balancer pools and Uniswap v2 pools have very similar properties around kind of the way they handle slippage. But what's to note about kind of atomic arbitrage or cyclic arbitrage MEV? This is MEV that can be captured like purely backrunning a transaction and is atomic on a single network. Is that it doesn't really relate to, or the dependence is less on the specific pool type itself. The dependence is on the other pools that are also on that network. For example, if you're trying to do a two-pool cyclic arbitrage, meaning, hey, there's two pools on Juno, both of them with Juno and Atom as the asset, is there an arbitrage opportunity where if there are two exact pools with the same assets, then any price difference has an arbitrage opportunity. So whenever their pools are in balance, there's an arbitrage opportunity. But that exact same pool type, and if there's only one Juno Atom pool on Juno, for example, that exact same pool type, that doesn't mean anything related to the MEV itself. So like cyclic arbitrage is a function of all the pools together and what those pools together allow for, like what routes they allow for, what imbalances that they can actually act upon. So Osmosis has two prevailing things. One, it has the largest DEX volume across Cosmos for now. And two, and so like it's not necessarily the best comparison to compare Osmosis versus Juno or Osmosis versus Terra's MEV extraction. And two, Osmosis is a permissionless protocol, so people can actually add new pools even if they're the same assets. And so that also adds to the factor of why you have, I think the last time we checked, there was like over 100 Osmo Atom pools, which may not be the best thing. Like permissionless is nice, but like also why there are over 100 Osmo Atom pools. But right, every time those pools are added, there's potentially more MEV opportunities that exist. Purely because just there's so many different combinations of different routes you can actually process through. So if we're just looking at MEV on Osmosis versus other chains today, it is clear that Osmosis has the most MEV compared to something like Juno or Terra, but the factor is less the AMM type and just kind of the network of different pools that exist on all the chains, and then the amount of volume being processed through them. In terms of the different pool types, you do imagine, though, that balancer pools or pools where the actual reserves can become imbalanced much more quickly have more MEV. So no hard numbers or no hard data analysis on our side yet around the difference between stable swap pools and balancer pool MEV in the Cosmos. But I actually assume that concentrated liquidity pools and normal like balancer Uniswap V2 pools will have more ability for MEV, and then stable swap pools will be used in these routes less to actually extract. You're not trying to use stable swap pools necessarily to abuse the slippage in them, but you'll use them to convert assets. Like if I want to go from Atom to ST Atom, with the least amount of slippage, because now there's a route that uses ST Atom. That's where I believe a lot of the stable swap pool usage will be in these MEV routes. It is kind of the path to get to the other route, to get to the other asset with the least amount of slippage and impact in your MEV profit.
Yeah, that makes complete sense. I mean, if you want as little slippage as possible, a stable swap pool just makes sense. So I've got a couple of questions as well. Nub asks, couldn't we just optimize trades for users instead of trying to capture what they're calling an extra tax from them? I'm sure you have a very interesting response to this.
Yeah, so I guess I have a simple response and then a complicated response. The simple response is, even today, we could still give users back the value that ProtoRev captures. Mm-hmm. So the governance proposal that passed was a proposal to say, yes, the Osmosis community wants to recapture this value and implement ProtoRev. But it has not put any statement around where this money goes. And so there was a follow-up proposal that says, hey, for the first X amount of months, I believe it's 6 months, ProtoRev is live, let's let the value accrue in a module account that later gets decided how it gets distributed. And personal opinion, I do think that's smart, just to kind of see how much it can accrue. And potentially there are things that are more useful to use the money with collectively rather than per transaction.
Right.
But there is a world where the Osmosis community decides, yes, actually this money does belong to the users. And so every time ProtoRev runs and it captures X amount of Osmo, give it back to the user every time. And so, to clear up any confusion, that is not allowed in the current version of ProtoRev. This is purely a governance decision, and then we will implement, kind of whatever the Osmosis community ends up wanting to do with the value captured. So that's the simple, today we could give it back to users answer. A more complicated answer about kind of optimal swaps in general and why can't we just have an optimal swap for all users is because doing anything that's quote unquote optimal on chain with the current state of AMM pools, concentrated liquidity pools, etc., is computationally expensive. And so David just previously talked about all the guardrails we add for ProtoRev. And one of those, one thing to note in that is if there are for example, like 1,000 swaps in a block on Osmosis that all create MEV opportunities, ProtoRev cannot capture the MEV for all 1,000 swaps. We have guardrails to say, and the guardrails being we have a pull point system essentially that every time we back run a transaction, we add to the pull points we used for that block. And then once we exceed the number of pull points used for that block, we stop running. So then, let's say we back run 20 swaps and then we've already hit our pull point usage limit. Then any swap after that, it will not run. And something to note just about, if we wanted to have some algorithm on chain to optimize the routes and execution price for all the swaps, is that you will run into an issue of increasing computation, and that will either impact block throughput or just the way that the protocol has to operate. And so a lot, I think, of what people want for optimal routing for normal swaps especially on a chain like Osmosis, is probably just routing through Osmo as an intermediate token and finding better routes that may take 2 hops instead of 1 or 3 hops instead of 2. And I do think a lot of that complexity should be pushed to the front end. But that is to just say this dream of current optimal routing on chain. And there are other chains working on this. And what the other chains do while they're working on this is change how the AMM completely works. Like, it's not using balancer pools, it's using a different type of pool. And so I think that conversation kind of just leads into a lot more nitty gritty details around how the pools are actually constructed and what the trade-offs there are, as well as just saying, can't front ends just do this? And then can't we just push the complexity to the front ends and let them compete on the best routes and the best user experience they give to users? So yeah, I guess that's my answer around that.
I did want to, so that kind of brings up a nice question. Also around I'm super interested with the POV and that kind of stuff. So like previously with protocol builder separation that lots of chains are doing, you couldn't even tell what stakers MEV is accruing to or anything like that, right? But with POV and building blocks on chain, it's basically giving the chain the power to control the MEV and block building, correct?
Yeah, exactly.
And we kind of internally have been viewing ProtoRev kind of also in the same light of POB. It's all about kind of giving the chain more power back and deciding how MEV is distributed. And so, eventually internally at Skip, at least we've been kind of merging the two ideas in our head of just the toolkit that we give Osmosis to recapture value and decide how, MEV is captured and redistributed and how their blocks are built. One more thing to note kind of about the differences there is that a lot of MEV is not only just cyclic arbitrage, but like Sex to Dex MEV, Binance to Osmosis, Coinbase to Osmosis, etc. And what a large want of POB is to be able to capture, that MEV as well and give it back to the community. And that is something that ProtoRev cannot do. So I don't want to pretend ProtoRev is like this end-all be-all solution for MEV on Osmosis. There are a lot of other, cross-chain, cross-domain facets of MEV that kind of the wrapper of POB giving Osmosis the ability to build those blocks can really shine there.
Yeah, one thing I wanted to add to what Jeremy was saying is that even if we did decide to build something like an optimal router on chain, we would run into the same issue that ProtoRev might, which is how much compute it uses. So the top of a block, like the few transactions at the top of the block, might be able to get optimal routing, and then the rest of the block does not get optimal routing. So it is a really difficult problem to solve in the most user UX efficient way. But yeah.
Okay, yeah, thanks for that explanation. That's like I said, the POB stuff is very exciting to me, and what you guys are working on. And with the talk that we've been going through with backrunning and cyclic arb and whatnot, Riley's suggested our chat's getting a little a good bit of questions right now. So Riley's suggesting that we have a little bit of Eli 5, if you guys could, on harmful MEV versus backrunning and cyclic arb, kind of like get the distinctions between the MEV that we can't see, that off-chain MEV, and then the backrunning and cyclic arb nature.
Yeah. So I think Sunny puts this really well, where there's like a meme of good versus bad MEV. And Sunny has had an explanation that bad MEV largely looks like MEV that relies on a transaction itself, whereas good MEV largely relies purely on blockchain state. And so what does that look like? So ProtoRev purely does backrun cyclic arbs. And what that means is after a transaction processes and after they swap, we look at the current chain state and says, hey, did this swap create any imbalances in the pools? If so, let us just rebalance those pools. And by doing the rebalancing, ProtoRev ends up accruing some value back from that. And what is important here is that we don't impact the execution price of the user that we backrun. Now, a lot of people, or there's a whole other group of MEV types of MEV that many people consider harmful, which is something called a sandwich attack. And what that looks like is it says, hey, this transaction in the mempool that hasn't landed yet has a slippage tolerance of 10%. But when I simulate it, I know they're only really going to incur a 1% slippage, which means if I'm somebody who wants to extract value from that user's transaction, I can do so if that user wants to swap Osmo to Juno and has 10% slippage, an attacker, what they would do is they swap Osmo to Juno first. So they swap in the same direction as the user to push up the price that the user will buy at. The user then buys it and then gets their slippage maxed out to, let's say, 10%. So the searcher will front run the user, push the price up. Then the user executes their trade on a more pricey asset. And then the searcher immediately sells the asset that they bought. And the reason why they can make a profit from the sale of that asset is because the user that they just sandwiched also pushed the price up more after their swap. And so this is in the camp of what many consider as harmful MEV, because it is essentially giving that user worst execution price and taking money from them. And so this is something that ProtoRev does not do, as well as POB will not allow. And the way we do that is by purely back running things and never front running things. But this is, I think a general good way to think about good versus bad MEV is MEV that only relies on chain state versus MEV that relies on the user transaction themselves. Well, and those are like the slippage tolerances.
Right. Go ahead.
Yeah. And then the other kind of category of MEV that's not related. So both sandwich attacks and like back runs is like purely on chain. You can see it, within a single chain. The other category of MEV is what people call cross chain MEV. So maybe there's a pool on Osmosis that has the same assets as a pool on Juno. Obviously, if they have a price imbalance, there's somebody who could make an arbitrage opportunity. It's just not an atomic one on a single chain anymore. It'll be buying assets on Osmosis and selling it on Juno. And so there's a category of MEV called cross-chain MEV. It is taking into account two different chains and trying to extract value there. And then more broadly, people consider cross-domain MEV largely to be, centralized exchange. There's a price there for an asset. It may be cheaper or more expensive on Osmosis, and then just buying low, selling high in those domains as well.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So that's a really great explanation of those types of MEV. A couple of I just want to address a couple of comments, and then we're gonna have to start wrapping it up. So in the chat we have Ben said sandwich attack isn't possible on Cosmos due to first in first out mempool anyway, which Riley already said. Something that all Cosmos chains are very well aware of is that there are validators on each network that do run their own custom mempool ordering software, basically, that reorders blocks for better MEV. And then Thomas asks, what prevents a validator from running their own version of Skip that just takes all the profits for themselves? And I mean, you guys could answer this, but the answer is very simple, is, if a validator, for instance, is running a custom ProtoRev module on, let's say, Osmosis, where it's installed as a module, they're going to app hash immediately because they'll be on a different chain than the main binary to run. That's just how building a binary works.
Yeah, and the key point here is that, and I'm looking at Thomas's questions as well, the custom clients that these validators potentially may run, if they run a custom client, they still are going to have to stay in consensus with other nodes. And the really cool thing about ProtoRev is because this logic is all built into consensus, they will, yeah, like you just said, they would immediately app hash. And so, at least from a ProtoRev perspective, there is nothing that a validator can do to steal money from ProtoRev. Because when that transaction processes, it will process the way ProtoRev has, because ProtoRev will change state and they will get out of consensus immediately. Now, for something like Skip select on Juno and Terra and the current centralized system that relies on Skip on those chains, it is possible for a validator to run their own custom version of Mev Tendermint that says, hey, every time Skip gives me a block that they said I should propose on Juno, I am going to swap out the, back run searcher transaction, and I'm going to in place my own. And so that is possible with current Mev Tendermint, but that's the hope that POB can prevent. And it's because the current state of affairs is that the mempool exists at the consensus layer, which is Tendermint, and Tendermint is not enforced in the protocol. And so each of these clients can have their own custom mempool implementation, and then it never gets seen in protocol. But after ABCI++ and with POB, we can move that mempool in protocol such that if there's any malicious activity that happens within that mempool, it will now cause app hashing, and it'll now be seen by all the other nodes running the software, and to be aware that somebody is trying to, deter the system. And so this is like the concerns Thomas is bringing up here is what we're trying to solve actually with modules like ProtoRev and POB.
Yeah, I can definitely agree.
Yeah, Thomas did bring up his question, but I still don't see how. And maybe we can have him as a speaker if they want to be a speaker. But I don't really see how a validator can run their own version of POB or ProtoRev and take the profits for themselves. But I don't know if he'd like to speak or not. But yeah, I guess I just don't believe that's possible. And I would love to be told how it is possible, if so.
Right.
I don't know if he's in here anymore.
I don't know either. However, we are getting to the end of our time, so we're going to open it up to the community for any other questions. Does anyone have anything for David or Jeremy about ProtoRev or what Skip is trying to do, what they're trying to walk away from, the centralized nature of certain things and move into more governance-controlled aspects of MEV capture? What are people's final thoughts or questions?
Oh, dope. Okay, so Riley asked, is Skip looking at any non-AMM related MEV opportunities in Cosmos? So we are. I mean, a big purpose. So there's two answers here. One, general block space auctions like Skip Select and POB will be able to incorporate arbitrary related MEV. So, for example, liquidations, cross-chain MEV opportunities, etc. And so that is like a huge win of just more generalized MEV solutions, is that they do just generally speaking capture back MEV. Now, in terms of liquidations, it seems for many app chains actually, the liquidation mechanism will be built into the protocol themselves such that they are efficiently extracted. So we haven't necessarily looked into any application specific MEV related to like a ProtoRev for liquidations, for example. But we're generally interested in looking at it from those kind of generalized solutions we're building. Just generalized block building. Hey, somebody wants to add an Oracle update as a transaction. How can we actually, auction off the right to be able to be the first one to liquidate? But what's interesting in the Cosmos ecosystem is that A lot of these liquidation mechanisms are being built as, within an app chain, and then those mechanisms themselves are, for example, automatically liquidating based on, current reserves and pools. So there's some space for us there, but also there's a lot of people innovating really cool mechanisms to do liquidations that, are already efficiently capturing a lot of what an external party could as well.
It's very interesting, especially with decoupling the block ordering from, or the mempool from the consensus mechanism. That's I think a little bit of being in this space is unique and novel approaches to technology and code, which, when you think about it, that's kind of neat to think about, because it does allow for a whole bunch of other types of applications to be built.
Yeah. I mean, even just the state of the art in Ethereum, where like Oracle updates for liquidations happen via, transactions that users have to submit, rather than it just automatically occurring as an end blocker or a begin blocker. The space already in Cosmos is already just experimenting with liquidation mechanisms that are far more advanced than just, hey, we need this incentive for any user to submit a transaction to actually do liquidations. And that, like, some, right, like, you can even think about just the power, like the toolkit Cosmos chains have reduces a lot of kind of some of the extractive MEV that you'd have to, pay a searcher or pay a party to do for you. Whereas in Cosmos, we can just do that in protocol. And so, yeah.
Which, I mean, if you wanna use a overused phrase, code is actually law at that point. And at least in my opinion, in a more secure manner than a smart contract. Exploits are still going to happen. RIP our pools version, was it 8 or 9? I forget. We were fortunate that we were able to track that, though. It took a while, but mistakes can still happen in code, but they tend to not be as disastrous as they are in Ethereum or any sort of smart contract based chain.
Yeah, I'm gonna just hold my tongue on this.
Not always, but we have come to the end of the episode on that wonderful fun note. So Jeremy and David, where can people keep up with Skip?
You can follow us at Skip Protocol on Twitter. We also have our own Discord, so you can go find us on Discord. And also, good plug, Water Spinner.
Yeah, let me redo that so it's hyperlinked. But yeah.
We recently, this week, released a form called, you can find it at ideas.skip.money, where we plan to talk a lot more about the things that we're working on at Skip, the interesting questions and topics we're diving into, and trying to just engage the community more broadly with those ideas and topics. And so you can find us on that forum. We'll be posting a lot more there. We'll be having a lot more chats there. Yeah. You can follow us on personal Twitters. At Juicy Jeremy on Twitter.
Terpeo.
Love it. I love it.
Yeah, that's amazing. I want to thank you guys again for coming along and talking about the updates and everything. I'm sure we'll have you along again once we see some developments happen and some new ideas. Congratulations again, by the way, for developing a successful module, and also thank you for working towards the idea of a less centralized, trusted entity to, basically just working towards that while also capturing the MEV in a fairer way, let's say, because having it go to the protocol to decide makes a lot more sense than a third party getting it.
Yeah, we agree. Thank you. This was fun.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah.
Well, go ahead.
I was just gonna say, yeah, thank you guys, and congrats on everything, and thank you in the audience.
All right. Well, have a good
Cool.
day, everyone. Don't forget to touch grass occasionally if you have some. And yeah, let's go. We're gonna make it.
Yeah, wag me. Take care, everybody.
Take
All
care.
right.
Bye-bye.
Thanks, guys.